headed down to College Station to Aggie Land, where Texas A&M is making a run at the college football playoff as we come down the stretch run of what has been a season unlike any other. And we are joined now by Billy Liucci, who is the owner of TexAgs.com, a wildly popular site that covers the Texas A&M Aggies. Billy, thanks for getting up early with us, first of all. And second, a lot of years I know you've covered Texas A&M. And in recent history, A&M has been in a position where we talk about them in September and October, and then they kind of have that swoon later in the season. 3 games left to play, coming down the stretch run, Auburn this weekend, then you got Ole Miss, then you got Tennessee. Why is this team different? Do you think they are? Where can they go? It's a lot of questions all rolled into one.
Yeah, and you're so right, Clay. I mean, I know your interest in A&M spiked, and when we first started to get to know each other was during the conference realignment, and then so you've been a close follower of A&M football since at least then. And right at the beginning of that, even with Johnny Manziel, don't forget that team lost. I think they were 2-2 to open conference play, so they didn't even have this opportunity. So it's been a while, but I'll tell you what the difference is, Clay. And I'm writing. I know everybody was down on A&M's offense this week, and it's funny because they ignore 12-7 against Louisville for Notre Dame. They hype up a 14-point win over North Carolina, and then A&M gets panned and drug over the coals for a 13-point win over LSU. This team in its last 4 games has gotten better and better, and they took a step back offensively. I think 3 weeks off and all the insanity of the contact tracing, which led to about 15 guys not being able to practice for 2 weeks, and I think it showed up. But if you look, here's what's different. What's different is Jimbo Fisher's teams historically have played their best football in November, and you saw him do that in year 1 under him. And I think second, Clay, they're not incredible at anything. When you watch them, you don't go, gosh, that's the best team in the country. But if you go back and look, they run the heck out of the football. They've got arguably one of the 2 best backs in the SEC, and Isaiah Spiller. They've got a future high-round draft pick at tight end. They've got 4 senior starters on the O-line, and the 5th guy's a sophomore. That'll probably be a first-round pick. They block. They've given up 3 sacks this year in 7 games. They run the football. They've got a senior quarterback that up until Saturday was playing the best ball of his career. And then defensively, quietly, they rank second in the SEC against the run, and they lead the conference in total defense. So this is a very well-balanced, well-rounded, up until they're 5th in the country in third down conversions, led the country heading into Saturday when they were miserable 2 of 16. So, Clay, here's the thing. They check every single box where they're like good at everything and really good at a lot of things. And there's very few what I would call weak spots in this football team. And the schedule that looks so daunting at the beginning of the year, they got by Alabama and Florida at 1-1, and then you really look at the rest of that schedule, and LSU is down, and Tennessee's down, and Auburn's just all right, and Mississippi State was bad, and Arkansas is better, but they're still probably going to finish 3-7. So a 10-game SEC schedule that wasn't nearly as daunting as it looked when they put it together.
We're talking to Billy Liucci. He's the owner of TexAgs.com. So I'm really kind of fascinated by the fact of the couple of games getting canceled, because we've talked a lot on this show, and I know you and I have texted back and forth about this. Mm-hmm. A&M had very few positive tests. It was all almost entirely contact tracing. Now that you're through that, what can you tell me about what occurred at A&M that led to 2 games being postponed, and how fortunate is A&M that they're in the SEC where you can get games postponed as opposed to canceled? Because if A&M has the same issue in the Big Ten or the Pac-12, those are games that never get made up.
Yeah, and could prove very costly, because you look at this playoff chase, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. But, I mean, losing a couple games there would have been devastating, especially winnable games, And so They had so here's what they had, Clay. They had one player test positive after Halloween, and they played Arkansas Halloween, and then that following week leading up to South Carolina, they had a starting safety not make the trip. He was positive. Okay, so he's out for the next 10 days, so 2 games. And coming back, they get back on Sunday, and they test on Sunday, and one player and one staffer. Let's just call it a GA. I don't know his exact position. We're not one of the main coaches, but one staffer and one player had it. Well, the player, you all of a sudden, so let's say he's a DB, a defensive back, which he was. So you had a defensive back, and you go team meal. They're sitting in little small tables. You're on the road in a hotel. Probably had a roommate.
Yep.
Who did he sit by on the plane? Okay, sat by this guy, this guy, this guy. So one player and one staffer led to like 6, just from the flight alone, 16 people contact traced.
That's insane.
16. So like between the positive test and the secondary, which wiped out. And here's the deal, Clay. It wasn't just more than a dozen players. It was also, I think of the 11 full-time coaches, like at least 7 of them were out for 2 weeks contact tracing because because the grad assistant and the one player that I guess his position coach was around. So by the time they missed Tennessee with all those guys out, no one else got it. That number never grew. Those guys were tested that were in quarantine for 2 weeks 7 times.
Oh.
Not one additional case. So when A&M by the next weekend when they played Ole Miss, they didn't have a single player in the program that had COVID, and they couldn't play a football game.
Just because. So, what do you know? What the quarantine process is like for the A&M guys? So, those guys who never test positive, what do they actually have to do? Do they just have to go sit in the, in their dorm room by themselves? Do they put them in a hotel room? What do they do for that quarantine process?
Well, they typically have. Most of the kids live off campus in either houses or apartments, so they're just kind of. I don't know exactly what they. I know that they can. They attend Zoom meetings and stuff, and stuff like that, but they can't be in the facilities. And I think they actually can work out. Like they can kind of go up there and run and stuff. The ones that don't have it, the ones that are in quarantine.
Because sometimes those guys are in a worse spot, right? Because if you test positive, you can test out by not testing positive anymore. But if you're contact traced, some of those guys can get multiple times contact traced, unfortunately, during the course of a season, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting. And I think they do a good job with the guys that have it. They're good. They're not even in the testing protocol. So if you think about that, and that's what teams don't release that information. And I'm sure you're sitting there all across the country, fans of their teams going, man, I wonder if this star player and this star player have had it. Because if they have, then you don't have to worry about them ever missing.
Yeah, you don't end up with a Denver Broncos-like situation where suddenly everybody has to not be able to play quarterback, right?
Yeah, and I think they should provide that info. It's not for gambling purposes, but just for the fans' peace of mind. If you look at if you're Florida with Kyle Trask, you're going to the SEC title game. Wouldn't you feel better knowing that he had already had it, so nothing can go wrong there? So there is that. That's an interesting part of it, but.
Especially with the playoff race coming up, because at least if you're Clemson. You're like, well, we know that we don't have to worry anymore about Trevor Lawrence, right? He's going to be there for all the big games that Clemson has the rest of the season.
No doubt about it. I mean, Trevor Lawrence is in the clear, and so it's wild to think that A&M had that few cases and couldn't play, and not only that, but like I said, couldn't practice for 2 weeks, and it you can see where it could mess up the entire season for a team. And the Aggies played LSU. They're probably fortunate they weren't playing a better team because they went out there and they did not look like the same team. But here's the thing. Here's my big complaint of the weekend as far as the A&M narrative went, and watching that game, rewatching it on TV. It was a pretty driving rainstorm. They hadn't played in 2 weeks. Kellen Mond tweeted the Monday all the quarantine guys got back and said, I'm back. So one can only assume that he was one of the quarantines. Didn't practice for 2 weeks. And so your quarterback practiced for 3 days leading up to LSU. He looked like a shell of himself. And A&M still led 20-0 before the end of the third quarter. Their last 4 games, by the end of the third quarter, they led LSU 20-0, Arkansas 42-17, South Carolina 34-0, and Mississippi State 28-7. You go back 5 games and they beat Florida. This team's been playing really good, and they've been throttling SEC opponents, and no one talked about it. And then all of a sudden, in the 1 week where they looked sloppy, and it was not. If I wasn't a fan of either team, I wouldn't have enjoyed watching that game unless you like seeing great defense, which A&M had. But everybody was just kind of piling on it, and I'm going, wait a second. It's 20-0 through 3. LSU's never been within 2 scores since towards the end of the first quarter. It's not. I didn't understand the hubbub, but it really doesn't matter for the Aggies, because if you look at that playoff picture, if they win out, they're going to be sitting right there, whether they win these next 3 games 100-0 or whether they win them each by a point. They're going to be sitting at number 5, and they're going to need just a little bit of help. Not much, though.
So, yeah, that's one of the big questions that I have that I think is really kind of fascinating about this entire process. We always have debates about how good someone is and assessing, let's say, the Big Ten versus the SEC or the ACC against the Big 12 or whatever else. How in the world do you assess a team that played 6, which may be the case with Ohio State, with a team that might play 12, like might be the case with Notre Dame, or a team that might play 10, like A&M, or 11, like Bama and Florida, and determine how to assess that overall?
I don't think you can assess it. I feel sorry for the committee on trying to figure that one out, because, and that's the wild card that really kind of came out of nowhere this past weekend, was the Big Ten wild card. Not just because of hey, what if Ohio State plays 5 games or 6, but then you've also got the wild card of Northwestern losing now. Now I don't think they'd have any chance against Ohio State, but if they were to somehow knock off Ohio State, if you're A&M, you're sitting there going, there's a possibility on 2 different levels now of the Big Ten not getting anybody in, and that would push A&M almost like by default up in there. And then the second part of what you're talking about, and it's so. How do you compare? Because normally, like you said, you could just sit there and go, okay, this conference did nothing. Of course, if it's the Big 12, they do nothing every preseason, every non-conference schedule, they do nothing. And then by the end of the year, people forget and just keep moving them up as they're beating each other, which is exactly what they're trying to do again with Oklahoma, which is just mind-blowing right now. I don't get it. That because they did play non-conference games, and there was the carnage of the Sun Belt. There was Texas Tech last second to beat Houston Baptist University. I mean, it is really truly a dumpster fire over there, not just in the conference, but specifically in Austin right now. But I don't think you can really decipher other than I talked with someone on the committee before the season started, and he was telling me it really is going to come down to, you hope you have a lot of really strong football minds and people that really understand the game, that when you're watching the games played, you can tell the difference between good football and not good football. Because like never before, you're going to have to lean on that when you're trying to evaluate the strength of conferences and things like that. So I think that's a lot of what's going on. I think the most fascinating thing that could end up happening, and I think it's a legit possibility, if Notre Dame beats Clemson again and A&M wins out, I think the Aggies will be in, as long as Bama beats Florida. But what the really fascinating one, and it starts to factor in everything you just asked about, what if Clemson beats Notre Dame by, I don't know, like say 14 points, where you watch that whole game and you're going, Notre Dame would never have beaten these guys. And they could never have beaten them without Trevor. Had Trevor not been out. If that's the case, but it's not a blowout. It's not 21-point blows. It's 10-14, but Clemson total game control, and then you've got a 9-1 A&M team whose only loss was to Bama, who beat Florida, and who is on an 8-game winning streak heading in. That's going to be the most fascinating debate and decision that comes down, is if things shake out like that. And I don't think that's too outlandish a possibility. I actually think that's you made me predict how things are going to go. I'd slightly lean towards thinking the Aggies win their last 3, and I'd slightly lean towards thinking Clemson by, more than a touchdown, but not in a blowout.
We're talking to Billy Liucci. He's the owner of TexAgs. You mentioned the Big 12. There's lots of smoke out there that Tom Herman is in danger of losing his job in Austin. He's asked about it virtually every week in his press conference. Tough loss for them against Iowa State. What are you hearing about that situation for Tom Herman, and who do you think Texas would like? A lot of interest, it seems, in Urban Meyer. The same kind of reports about Urban Meyer that there were about Nick Saban back in the day. $10 million offer. Shelley Myers looking around at houses. Everybody's wife always goes to look at houses. What do you think Texas does, and who are you hearing they might be interested in?
I think Texas moves on Tom Herman, and I've had a discussion with people who I respect that don't think that. I just do. Here's the thing, Clay. This is like, whether it's Michigan, Ohio State, whether it's Alabama, whether it's Auburn with Alabama, it's A&M and Texas and Oklahoma. When Oklahoma's winning and Texas can't beat them, and when you're losing recruits, legacy recruits, who's the Brockermeyer twins, whose father was an All-American tackle, probably the best O-lineman in school history, and they're going to Alabama. Texas kids, they live up in Fort Worth, and they're going to Alabama. And A&M is really getting who they want in Texas in all the head-to-heads with the Longhorns right now, and that's getting more. That stranglehold's getting more by the day with each passing week that A&M wins a game. It is it's a real problem for Texas, because if you bring Tom Herman back right now, I just don't see how, if you're an administrator, a decision maker, a big donor, I don't see how you can have any confidence or faith. There's got to be just this giant vote of no confidence if you had asked, can this man and his staff recruit at the level they need to? And as you know, Clay, it's not just this 21 class, which is like they're dead in the water on this one, but it's also the 22 class, which also happens to be the most loaded class I've seen in 25 years of covering this state. So, I mean, if you can fall so far behind that I don't care if they hire Urban Meyer with Nick Saban as his defensive coordinator. It's going to be hard to dig out of that kind of hole, and I think that's what they're scared of more than anything. And you know how success on the other side drives those decisions. A lot of times they're panic driven, right? And if A&M wins the next couple weeks and it looks like they have a real look at the playoff, and Oklahoma's righted the ship after those 2 losses, and you're going to sit there and go tell all your donors and your big money people, hey, we're going to ride this out for another year because, the pandemic and the climate, and, I just don't – big business, man, and I just don't think it's going to fly. I know if you're an A&M fan, trust me, I know, because I read it every single day. I know you're hoping that they don't change coaches, and Aggies were in a very weird spot on Saturday, because I know a lot of buddies of mine that were watching it that were rooting for Texas to win that game, and they felt really weird doing that, because you weren't just rooting for them to win. Kansas State's terrible. Kansas is terrible. You were pulling for them to make it, to advance to the Big 12 title game, and maybe even have a chance to win it with a mild upset over OU, who they went to 4 overtimes with. And A&M fans didn't even care. Like, oh, fine, let them win the Big 12. That's how just kind of neutered Herman and that program are over there right now.
So
and I don't say that
if it's not, I get it. I think it's kind of fascinating. If it's not Urban Meyer, who do you think they would look to?
I don't know. I mean, I really, I've seen a list of about 10 different names, and they get carried away. I've always thought, and it doesn't seem like right now he'd have, to me, if I'm looking, James Franklin I've always thought would be a good fit for that program.
I think he would have been a great hire, but now they're 1-5, and I don't know
Yeah,
how you justify firing Tom Herman in a COVID year for not having a good enough year and go hire, a Penn State coach who went 1-5.
exactly. I thought they should have hired him when they did hire
Tom Herman, yeah.
or Charlie Strong. I forget which one it was, but when he was just
I think it was Charlie Strong the first
Vandy.
time that he was before he went to Penn State.
Yeah, I thought he was going to rip him from your Commodores. Actually,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
but Texas a lot of times would think they're too good to do that, and so I've always thought Gary Patterson would be a great fit there, but now he's a little long in the tooth. Again, another one you'd wonder if they could have hired either of the last two times. I've always thought he would leave for A&M or Texas. I don't know what's out there. Chris Harsin has ties to the program. He's done a nice job at Boise. What's Clemson's offensive coordinator's name? I've seen his name come up.
Yep.
I don't think Texas. I don't think Texas goes that route. I mean, one of the early names they were throwing around was Kyle Shanahan. The last time they threw around John Harbaugh, like they do this. And I go back to what you just said, and I think that's got to be their big concern is if you make a change on Tom Herman, who's not terrible. He's not terrible, but if you make a change there and you don't get an Urban Meyer, I mean, then I think you've got they're not going to go hire Hugh Freeze over there. So if you don't get Urban, would you be better off to wait another year and see how Herman does? But see, to me, without Sam Ehlinger, without Joseph Osai, they've already had a couple of opt-outs with guys that are going to get drafted. I just don't see how next year gets any better for them. And it's pretty remarkable, Clay. If you want to compare Kevin Sumlin and Tom Herman, Sumlin was an assistant at A&M under a legend in R.C. Slocum. Herman was an assistant at Texas under a legend in Mack Brown. Sumlin went to OU, won a national title as an offensive assistant under Bob Stoops. Herman, Ohio State, assistant under Urban Meyer, national championship. They both went to U of H. One went back to A&M. One went back to Texas. Strong starts there. Herman in year, I guess, 2 wins that Sugar Bowl. Sumlin, obviously, we know what happened in year 1. And then it just didn't quite work out. And, for the thing to go full circle, I guess it would have to be, they ended up getting Urban, like A&M went and got a national title winner and winning coach in Jimbo Fisher, and both of them would have been relatively low-hanging fruit in the grand scheme of things with Urban not coaching, and Jimbo, in hindsight, now everybody knows, was clearly not getting what he wanted at Florida State and would have left as soon as something, as prestigious as A&M came around, with as good a job opportunity as the Aggies presented.